Hey friends, thanks so much for joining us. As always, we do appreciate you taking the time to click play, and thanks too for visiting us at sgtreport.com, where we try to give you real news, the antidote to corporate propaganda 24/7. On the line today, we have our good friend Jeff Nielson from Bullion Bulls Canada. Jeff, how you doing, man?
Not too bad. Always nice to be here. Kind of like a home away from home for me.
Yeah, it is. It's been a long time since we last spoke, and of course, you were one of the first interviewees that I really ever invited on the show, so we've had a long-standing relationship. Also on the line are Rory and Peter from SGT Report. Guys, how you doing?
Doing well.
Doing real good.
All right, well, nice to have everybody here. There's so much going on in the world, especially in the world of precious metals. We have a lot to talk about, and really no particular agenda, so this will be a little bit of a free-form flow, and I think that's the way we like it with Jeff, because he's so well-versed in all things bankster, the one bank, and precious metals. And Jeff, congratulations. I understand you're now a contributing writer over at Sprott Money, a division of Sprott Asset Management. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I'm certainly excited myself. We've done a little publishing deal where I'm going to write some pieces exclusively for them, and of course they're also going to print some of my pieces from BBC. So I'm really happy to see my work appearing there, because this is one of the financial institutions in which I myself place a lot of confidence.
Well, me too, and I think what's neat about it is that they kind of have given the silent seal of approval on SGT Report 2. We had the pleasure of speaking with Rick Rule recently, and of course, if they didn't see eye to eye on a lot of the things we do over at SGT Report, he would not have come on. And I think that they must know that you are one of our regulars at SGT Report too. So what a neat thing to know. I don't think J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs would be quite as enthusiastic to invite Jeff Nielson on to write for them.
Yeah, no publishing offers coming from that end.
All right, well, so much to talk about. I should start with this article that you wrote called The Matrix, 2014 version, in which you talk about China currency manipulation. And I want to tie it together into sort of the pop culture by mentioning that my wife and I were watching House of Cards Season 2, Episode 5 on Netflix, which covers China currency manipulation. It's very much fiction meets pop culture meets fiction, and I don't even know what to make of it. But let's talk about your article, The Matrix, 2014.
Well, there's a couple of things here. First of all, we have, the paradigm I'm using itself. I mean, if I go back even a year or so, I would have been hesitant to have used that type of a metaphor in one of my commentaries. But now we're seeing events which are so extreme and contradictions which are so stark that it's hard to come up with any other metaphors that are worthy of describing what's taking place here. So, if we go back a little ways in time, one of the constants in the U.S. political scene was that, any time China's currency slid even a tiny bit in value, we would have a chorus of cries saying, "Oh, China's manipulating their currency lower. They're trying to get more imports and steal U.S. jobs." And then there would be the saber rattling where they'd threaten economic sanctions against China. And, this happened every time, and sometimes even when the currency simply stayed flat, because they wanted China's currency to rise versus the dollar. This was the refrain we were always hearing. And now suddenly, the beginning of 2014, when it's convenient for the bankers to be pushing all the other currencies lower because they're trying to inspire some phony confidence in the dollar, now we can see China's currency fall in value substantially, and there's not a peep from these same political Pavlov's dogs. And now, of course, we've got the currency falling fast, much faster than at any time in 2012 or 2013, and yet not one single player in Washington has said a peep about currency manipulation from China.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about this because even watching that show, it was confusing to me because it's hard to kind of tell where fiction meets reality anymore, and I'm not that well versed in China currency manipulation. And I did think it was funny, though, that Frank wanted to work with the Chinese to get the money to build the bridge, because God knows we can't come up with the money to build the bridge ourselves in this country. We need to borrow it from China. So it's very much the Matrix on television and meets the Matrix in the real world. It can get kind of confusing even for those of us that pay attention, can't it?
Well, and disinformation is precisely the word, because at the very time we have had all of these accusations from the U.S. that China is manipulating its currency, what we actually, in fact, see taking place in the real world are regulators in Europe and even in the U.S. now investigating Western bankers and U.S. bankers for the serial manipulation of all of the world's currencies. So it's the old cliche about the pot calling the kettle black, and people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And so that's perhaps one of the reasons that we're not seeing all this finger pointing at China right now, because it's the West's bankers who are currently under investigation for precisely what they've been accusing China of doing for the past several years.
That's right, and it doesn't come up in House of Cards that the Western banks are the criminal banks. And of course, it never comes up in that show that J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank are guilty of criminal activities, as of course they are. So it's funny, you always need to take those types of programs with a grain of salt. I just think it's interesting when they tie in real-world events loosely into their storylines. There's so much to talk about. We've seen such great action in silver and gold and the metals prices recently, Jeff. What would you guys like to talk about next? Rory, Peter, Jeff, what's on your agendas?
Well, I've got a question regarding the mining sector, Jeff, if you feel like taking that on.
Oh, sure. I'm always interested in talking about the miners.
Okay. And with the global slowdown in mining, along with Barrick and a couple of the other major mining companies reporting massive decreases in their reserves, how do you see the production of precious metals being impacted throughout the rest of the year?
Well, in fact, I was looking very closely at the quarterly reports that those big miners were putting out. And I mean, it was just horrific because, the point here is it was not just that they were reporting declines in their reserves, which is terrible news for any commodity producer, but they were reporting massive losses as well. And, so this is the whole thing with dynamics of mining. If you're having, one problem in terms of, say, declining reserves, but you're still making a lot of money, you can use the profits to try to rebuild the reserves. Or conversely, if you're growing your reserves, but you're losing money, there's the hope that you can sell those reserves down the road and get back into the black. But when you're losing reserves at a sharp rate and losing money at a sharp rate, that spells annihilation.
Yes. Because last year, Sean, I don't know if you remember this or not, but when we did that mega precious metals update and you and I were going through all the actual production cost, and it seems like that, if I remember correctly, the average production cost for the majors is somewhere around $1,400, $1,500 an ounce. And with it running, for the past, year and a half, 18 months at $1,300 roughly, I mean, they've got to be just bleeding money all over the place.
Well, see, there's two things here. First of all, even that $1,500 figure couldn't even really be considered a totally inclusive cost to produce an ounce of gold, because what it doesn't include is all the money spent by the exploration juniors. They're the feeder companies that get all of this gold production started. They're the ones out there in the bush finding new discoveries. The big companies themselves rarely find anything new. They look to these junior companies to find things, and then they buy it off of them once they find something large. So the full cost to produce an ounce of gold is probably closer to $2,000 an ounce. But then, of course, the other interesting point here is if you've been following the corporate media, there have been lots and lots of reports, wishful thinking, some might say, that the miners are going to start hedging their gold production again. And clearly, this is one of the major goals of the one bank, because, of course, what hedging means in terms of gold production is it means taking ounces of gold that haven't even been dug out of the ground yet and selling them onto the market. So there's two wonderful aspects to this which the banksters love. First of all, of course, the activity depresses the price because you're increasing the supply onto the market. And then, it also expands this supply at a time when inventories are at a critical low. So, they're desperate to try to get these miners to go down that suicidal path of hedging again. And this could very likely be one of the major reasons that they've been holding prices so low for so long.
Peter, do you have a question for Jeff before I follow up on one I've got?
Yeah, Jeff, I wanted to talk to you about your article, The U.S. Greater Depression Exposed Part 2, that you wrote a week ago Saturday. And you talked about, I'll just quote what you said, the downward spiral in the Greater Depression is, in fact, eternal collapse. The final result of this economic devolution can only mean the transformation of the United States into essentially a third world nation. And as I read that, your words, I just think about the people that I hang around with on a daily basis in my circles, and maybe they don't understand everything that we're talking about with silver and gold and the manipulation and everything, but I can tell you the people that I hang around with every day, they're tired and they are just ticked off at everything that's going on with our government, the regulation, our constitutional rights eroded, us being lectured at, programs that we don't want being shoved down our throat. And I'm in this world every day, and I'm just wondering, the people that you hang around with in Canada, do you have that same sense there, or what is the sense when Canadians are looking south at us and what we're doing, I guess?
Well, frankly, up here in Canada, I'm quite dismayed because I mostly see nothing but apathy. Of course, our economy started this collective crash in the West as the strongest of all Western economies. So that gave us a cushion before, we started to feel the sort of pain that is being, felt severely in most other Western economies right now. And, because of this, because of some natural naivety on the part of Canadians, there's very little awareness here, and there isn't even a significant amount of discontent. It's more that people are downtrodden than they are enraged, and that's what has me so concerned. Because, of course, anger tends to channel itself into action, but being downtrodden and discouraged, it tends to simply encourage more apathy.
What are you seeing up there in Canada, just as far as food inflation, fuel inflation, say the last 2-3 years?
Well, I do my own shopping, and so I would peg food inflation at somewhere between 20 and 30% per year here in Canada. But, of course, it depends what you're buying in your basket. I try to eat fairly healthy, so I'm buying lots of fresh foods, fresh meats and vegetables, and, of course, that's where you're seeing the biggest increases in prices.
I should add to that, when we were at Target probably 2 weeks ago, I was there with my wife, and we were walking the aisles doing a little bit of food shopping, and we were in the cereal aisle, you guys. I have never seen such diminutive boxes of cereal as I saw in the Target aisle, and I meant to take a picture and send it out on Twitter, and we got sidetracked with our kids there, and I didn't do it. But my gosh, what we see happening here in the States, Jeff, is a box of cereal that used to be 18 ounces for $2.99 is now 12 ounces for $3.29. And that's how they're masking inflation, I think, to a large degree.
For sure. And I mentioned that product downsizing in the first part of the article that Peter referred to, because, it's a telltale sign of high inflation. The only other time in any of our lives when we would have seen this similar wave of product downsizing in the supermarkets was during the high inflation era of the 1970s. And of course, that's the only official high inflation era we've ever lived through, because they're telling us today that we don't live in a high inflation era. But, when you see the same product downsizing taking place today that we saw 40 years ago, obviously what we're seeing is another desperation move by product manufacturers to do exactly what you said, Sean, to hide inflation.
Well, and I also love how they spin the smaller sizes as this is better for you. This says 20% less fat because you're only getting 80% the product that we used to sell.
Well, let me take just a second to get into some of the inflation lies here, because one of the ways they create this phony inflation rate is through what they call hedonic adjustments. And, this is where there'll be some change made in a product by a manufacturer. And like, for instance, say a food manufacturer puts a cardboard handle on the box of one of its packages of cereal, but then jacks up the price 20%. Well, the way these liars cook the numbers is they'll say, okay, well, sure, the price went up 20%, but it's got this fantastic new handle on it, which makes it at least 25% more valuable. So we're going to call this a 5% decrease in price because of our hedonic adjustment. And, so this is just one of the ridiculous lies they come up with to depress the inflation rate. And of course, their basket itself, they refuse to include anything in their basket for calculating the rate of inflation if the price is going up quickly. That automatically excludes it from the basket. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be milk, it could be bread. If the price is going up quickly, it's out of the calculation.
Convenient.
Yeah, how convenient. It's kind of how they seem to run the unemployment figures too. If you, if you've stopped looking for work, then, well, you must not want to work. So why would we count you as unemployed? So the unemployment rate, Jeff, in this country is in the low 6%, according to the government, even though there's probably 25% of Americans who would like to have a good job who can't find one.
I tackled that commentary specifically in a previous piece, and my estimate is that there are more than 50 million Americans unemployed. And like you say, Sean, that would translate into an unemployment rate of over 25% if you project the number of people that could and should be working in this economy if it was healthy. So yes, that's roughly the percent figure we're talking about, and that's what it translates into in the bodies. Over 50 million Americans who need jobs and can't get them.
It's so extraordinary. It really is the picture of the Matrix. And, the Chakosky brothers did that great movie with Keanu Reeves that has really become a sci-fi classic, and it is an excellent metaphor for the world in which we live, because those who are still not awake, they live in the Matrix. They truly believe that the economy has gotten better, that unemployment is in the low 6% range, that inflation is under control, that our nation is spreading liberty and democracy throughout the planet, which is why we keep going into these foreign nations. It is truly a crazy, crazy time to be alive, but it's an exciting time to be alive, because for those of us who are awake, we can cite real-world examples of the Matrix, like LIBOR manipulation, like Boffin saying that precious metals manipulation by the criminal banks is as severe or maybe worse than LIBOR manipulation. We can cite the fact that Mexican drug cartel and terrorist organization money laundering by HSBC and other criminal banks is something for which people ought to go to prison. Of course, no one has. It is just truly astounding, Jeff. Do you ever scratch your head and just say, how did we get here, and how in the world are we going to get out of this, when we live in a world where it had been mentioned recently that the CFTC was going to welcome Blythe Masters into the fold? It's a comedy at this point. It's a disgusting, tragicomedy.
Well, it's because things are so extreme that, I reached the conclusion quite some time ago that we're dealing with a genuine phenomenon of brainwashing here. Because it's not a matter of what's being reported to us as being simply incorrect. Rather, it's generally, literally the exact opposite of what is taking place in the world. The news is perverse. And of course, the only way that you can sell perverse lies to people, stating that black is white, up is down, and so on, is if they're brainwashed. Because if there's any real brainwave activity taking place, those sorts of lies cannot be processed. They stick out, they trip up people, and suddenly they realize there's something wrong. When the sheep continue to snooze, despite the perverse news we get on a day-to-day basis, we know they're brainwashed.
And with that, I mean, with all of the black swans that have just been talked about right here, they're obviously circling. What is the one thing that really has you most concerned, Jeff? And what are you doing to prepare for the possibility of it coming to fruition?
Well, it totally depends whether you're talking about immediate short term or big term, big picture long term. Of course, the big picture long term, it's just that horrific chart that I keep splashing in front of people on the U.S. adjusted monetary base. A vertical line in the money printing. I mean, that's you can't spell out hyperinflation any more clearly than that. So I mean, that's the big picture worry that must trump everything else, because it'll overwhelm everything else that's taking place. The immediate short-term concern, of course, is the crisis in the Ukraine. This isn't just some other minor former Soviet satellite state. This is perhaps Russia's most important ally, situated very close to some of its most important cities. And here we have the West trying to suck it into its own sphere of influence, and then of course load it up with missile bases.
That's right. That's absolutely right. It may be the most important issue for us to talk about because, again, as I mentioned earlier, the West, our own government, wants the people of this nation to believe, just like they did with Syria, that we need to go in, we need to make change, we need to support revolution, this is what we need to do because it's in the benefit of the U.S. government and the U.S. people. When I think if people were to be honest and really understand the situation, Jeff, if you're not a fan of thermonuclear war, maybe we ought to stay out of the affairs of the Ukraine and Putin, because as Putin well knows, NATO is surrounding Russia with what they're calling a missile defense shield, and Putin and Russia see that as an offensive first strike opportunity for NATO. So this is very, very serious stuff. this is only going to get more and more serious, and every time there seems to be some sort of peace agreement, the very next day, things seem to deteriorate.
Well, and of course, apart from the strategic importance of that territory, there's this large ethnic population of Russians living in the Ukraine. And so, there's this massive moral obligation upon Russia not to abandon some of its own people to this thug regime, which is about to, totally take over the nation. And so it's not a matter of Russia, wanting to intervene here. They're being forced to intervene. And of course, on the other side, we have the U.S., the only nation in the world that ever is insane enough to get into policy discussions about, winning a first strike nuclear war. This is, what I said in my latest issue of the Daily Grind, something that's approaching the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of its potential severity.
Yeah, and it's madness because, when we spoke with Rob Kirby, our friend from Kirby Analytics the other day, he said, and he's been saying for a very long time, and it pains him to say it, that we, our government, not we the people, but our government, this entity in charge of our government and in the West, we're no longer the good guys. Even though that's the spin put on it by the Mockingbird mainstream media, that's the spin put on it by John Kerry and Barack Obama, that's the spin put on it by the politicians. But if you understand geopolitics and the real story, this nation is involved in running around the world and starting war after war after war. And this situation in the Ukraine is just really, really scary because Putin is really not a man to be trifled with.
Well, and, saying, quote unquote, not the good guys, that's probably one of the bigger understatements I've seen around here because, what we have here is clearly an evil empire. I've labeled it myself the Fourth Reich because it is so belligerent, it's so fascist in its behavior, and thus so dangerous because, it's, fascist regimes that seek to use war as a policy tool the most often. And of course, in the case of Hitler, he took over a devastated nation, which is why that version of fascism, basically became militarized immediately. But in our case, they were spending their first few decades in power, completing the plundering of our nations. And now that these nations lie in economic ruin, of course, this is where we get to the later stages of fascism, where they seek to start wars either to distract their own populations or to steal from their neighbors.
I know you're working on a piece surrounding this issue of the disintegration of ETF gold funds, GLD, etc. Maybe we talk a little bit about that because, of course, that represents paper gold. We at SGT Report and the other great sites that we love and the contributors out there like TF Metals, Silver Doctors, Brother John F., we're all big advocates of physical precious metals because that is the real world tangible life raft you're going to need when all hell breaks loose. Jeff, let's just talk about the real world tangible aspects of physical silver and gold and the values they represent with silver around 21. It's still an awfully affordable way to buy insurance, isn't it?
Well, one of the reasons I'm focusing on those, those gold fraud funds is because the whole paper called gold and paper called silver scam is a major part of this whole paradigm of manipulation. And it plays into it in two ways. First of all, these ETF funds are major tools in the day-to-day game of market manipulation because they allow the bankers to have these large holdings they can play with. And of course, these pools of bullion they can borrow from their own clients to short onto the market. But the other side of it is, as we see these funds now disintegrating, is that it can very easily trigger a decoupling in the market, where we finally see some legitimacy emerge in terms of the price of physical gold and silver. And of course, we've seen a bit of this in India because they've had this major restriction on gold imports into India, causing massive gold smuggling into India. And at one point, they were reporting that there were essentially two prices for gold in India. There was the official price for the minimal amount of gold that could be legally imported, and then there was the unofficial black market price for the greater and greater quantities of gold being purchased illegitimately under the table. And so, this decoupling is so important because it's a way for us to see real prices. If suddenly one day we wake up and there's actually, media sources saying, oh, this is the price for paper gold, quote unquote, and this is the price for real gold, well, then, of course, we start to get into, some real values and a correction towards sanity.
Well, Jeff, as always, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to spend time with us and our audience. It's always so nice to talk with you in this roundtable. This sort of no agenda roundtable has been a fun way to do this. So I want to thank Rory and Peter, too, for taking the time for joining us. Guys, thanks so much.
Thank you.
You got it.
Always a pleasure to be here, and I enjoy these discussions immensely.
All right, brother, just remind people about your home base website over there, and maybe tell us a little bit more about where they can find your work over at Sprott Money.
My website is bullionbullscanada.com. That's where I publish all of my original commentaries. And then I'm currently having approximately 2 pieces a week published under the Sprott Money News link. And generally one of those pieces will be from Bullion Bulls Canada, and one piece will be one that I'm writing exclusively for Sprott Money.
Well, it's exciting that you're over there. Again, I think it's a real feather in your cap, and good luck to you, Jeff. We appreciate your work.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to listen, and thanks again for tuning in over at sgtreport.com for your daily news and information. We very much do appreciate it. Have a great one. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.